So as Satya said, our conversation is going to be about population implosion. So I'd like to start with a round robin. And is population collapse overblown? Is this something that we should all be concerned about? I'm assuming the answer is yes, but I'd love a short why from each of you. You can start you off at the end, Lyman.
Yes, population decline is something to be worried about. And my short why would be because we know it's not happening because people want it to happen. That is, population collapse is being driven by people not achieving what they want in life, namely, on average, 2.1 kids-ish, 2.2, 1.9, somewhere in there. So anytime you see a major social trend going the opposite direction as what huge majorities of the population say they want, it's a little bit of a red flag.
Yes, it's a problem. I think it's still underrated, even by people who talk about it. One of the reasons someone like Elon Musk is into natalism is because he understands exponential growth, and by the same token, understands exponential decay. And one of the issues with population collapse in general is things are baked in, and the birth rate this year affects the labor market in 20 years. And so you can't be too early to the problem, because one of the side effects of declining fertility is society becomes less hospitable to families because the culture changes, the market changes. And so if you wait until you're in actual population free fall, it's way too late.
I mean, being on this panel, presumably we think it's an issue. I don't think it's the issue that animates most of the work we're doing, but to me it indicates the underlying symptom that it's very hard to have the freedom to make all the choices you'd like to make. And thinking about how we structure systems to enable people to live their best life. And in cases where people don't want children, that's great, that's their best life. But in cases where people do want children and can't afford to have them, or society makes it difficult for them to have them, I think that's a problem that's worth thinking about.
And speaking to that, Derek, you've done a lot of work on the child tax credits. Tell us a little bit about how you see that as a solution or baked in with other policy solutions.
Right. Thanks for that. And, it's very happy to be on stage with Sam. We go back many years as co-conspirators in what I didn't call at the time, but now think of as policy philanthropy. So our ability as civic-minded individuals to influence policy outcomes, when you combine really smart analytical policy design, data and evidence about the efficacy of a policy, and advocacy with public officials and their staffs around what kinds of systems changes can make a real benefit in people's lives, is a very powerful way to do philanthropy. And after a career in finance, I stopped in 2015 to begin thinking about this kind of project, and the child tax credit was the first policy change I got very excited about. This was taking a credit that is like a gift card you could only spend at the IRS, and for many people, they didn't have enough of a bill at the IRS to use the whole value of the gift card, and that was worthless. And so how could you change that to be a gift card that was redeemable for cash if you couldn't use it at the IRS store? And a lot of the evidence suggested that that was a massive high return on investment in kids' outcomes and in parents' outcomes. And so we tried to build the political will and the evidence from progressive messaging all the way through conservative messaging on what that policy would mean for kids and for families. And amazingly, some handful of people, not thousands of people, did work. And for 1 year in the American Rescue Plan, that passed, and it gave tremendous resources to families, and unfortunately it then expired. But I think one of the things we should all think about is how to turn something like that permanent.
And the inverse. So JD Vance has said a lot about childless cat ladies. I'm going to call on my colleague Sam, who is the only childless person on stage here.
I'm a childless cat man, yeah.
So is the inverse going to work? Can we just tax the childless instead of giving tax credits to those of us with children? My child is in the back, and that's why I'm here.
That's a good question. Big picture, these financial incentives, one way or the other, are barely move the needle. There are birth subsidies and things in that realm that have had some effect, but it's $100,000 of outlays for every marginal child born, which arguably is actually still cheap compared to the social welfare and GDP and every other economic quantitative measure you can have of having that baby come into existence. But it's not going to be the decisive factor. Like really what's driving birth decline is mostly cultural. It's opportunity cost, the structure of the economy, the timing of your education and your career, all these factors, and money can help on the margin, but I think it has to be part of a broader sort of whole of society strategy that activates cultural prestige and what's high status, that affects the availability of housing, right? Like, can you afford to have 5 kids and live in an urban area where the rent is too high for someone living in a studio apartment? Can you go on the bus and not get harassed? Are there, restaurants that service you? Even broader things, like I think also this is a sort of criminal justice issue. Like we have locked up a lot of fathers in this country, and a lot of states don't have visitation rights and things like that. And those kind of things, even if they're small on the margin, can send a signal, a broader cultural signal, in addition with monetary incentives, that this is something that we're prioritizing.
And Lyman, as thinking about the cultural side of things, I'd love to hear your take on is the cultural shifts, is the more secularization and less religious population impacting this?
So yeah, I mean, one of the best predictors of higher fertility at an individual level or a social level is religiosity, particularly Abrahamic religions. We don't observe this among Buddhism, Hinduism. So it's not just the sort of collectivity of religion. There's also kind of specific belief and transcendent statements involved. But it's worth noting that successful pronatal policy is not strictly dependent on religious people. So like in the US right now, weekly religious attenders still have a total fertility rate of around 2.1. Non-religious people who never attend church, are at about 1.2. Now, that's a very large gap, and you might say, well, yeah, religious people have more kids, but the truth is, 10 years ago, religious people were still at 2 or 2.1, and non-religious people were at 1.7. So we have a unique fertility decline among the non-religious. It's not just that there's a compositional shift in our society. And that should tell us that there's something else going on. And I think it's worth mentioning, what Sam said was right, that like fiscal incentives to have children, they do have effects. We have a good literature on this, but it is costly. At the same time, there's only a few countries that have been at this game for a long time. That is long enough for generational timelines to actually show us what happens. And one of those is France. And when France started rolling out pronatal policies in the 1930s, and especially after World War II, their stated goal was to reverse the declining population ratio in comparison to Germany, for reasons that make sense if you're a French long-term strategist. And it took a while. But today, depending on, you have to make some simplifying assumptions about heritability of fertility preferences and things like that. But today, France has, like 60 million people? And between 3 and 10 million of them exist because of these policies, because of their effect on fertility. So between 5 and 15% of all French people alive today are caused by a choice of, frankly, French generals more than politicians in the 1930s and 1940s. So when we think about these small effects, there is an exponential logic, right? You only raise fertility 0.1 in one generation, but that 0.1 is there to breed in the next generation and the next one. And when you look at countries that have been doing this for 3 generations, there's policy, and then the policy creates a culture. And then the culture creates support for the policy. You see the same thing in Israel. Israel has the most generous pro-family policies in the world. People are like, oh, Israel has high fertility because of the Hasidic Jews. Okay, yeah, but like secular Israeli Jews who have like no religious attachment at all have 2 kids on average. Secular Jews in Europe and the US have like 0.9 on average. So there's a policy element here. Hasidic Jews in Israel have more kids than Hasidic Jews in the US. So these things go together. The culture supports the policy supports the culture. As Sam said, it's a whole of society thing. It has to start somewhere, and government as a singular central actor can act as a part of a catalyst.
And what other countries are we seeing with interesting outcomes? It seems like it's a international problem. We're hearing a lot about what's going on in East Asia and how Japan and South Korea and China are imploding. So are they trying these policies? Is anything working?
A lot of countries are trying things. The UN actually used to formally survey this, and they've kind of stopped that. I think maybe it was getting uncomfortable for them because the number of countries that officially were pronatal kept rising. And again, we like Quebec had a baby bonus for a while. A couple Spanish and Italian provinces did. And we know that these policies do somewhat increase fertility. Your biggest policy-caused fertility rebound that we have good documentation on is in the country of Georgia. And it was a 1-2 punch. Basically, a religious leader made a change in baptism policy that encouraged people to have a third child. And it worked. Fertility rose from 1.6 to 2.2 in 18 months. It remained above 2 for the next 12 years. Right now it's like 1.92. It has declined over time. But what's often lost in this is, there's this big cultural intervention that boosted fertility. 3 years later, the government came along and increased child subsidies dramatically because the government said, oh, hey, if this is what the church that's 90% of our population is doing, let's support that. So we do see that there are countries that try policies. I mean, Hungary, if you look at tempo-adjusted fertility, so this is controlling for the fact that people change the time of when they have kids. Hungary's fertility, the implied family size from Hungary's fertility was declining at one of the fastest rates in Europe until 2013, when it turned on a dime and started rising. Now, you will not see that statistic because people prefer to just use the basic TFR, which is a little too simple. These policies have effects. They work. Children are not magical. They're a normal good like anything else. Give people money, they buy more of them. We know this from like lottery studies, randomized controlled trials, and financial transfers. Like, this is how kids work. But they're really expensive normal goods. So you don't get like huge numbers of them right away for like a $200 increase in a credit.
Right. Can I say one other thing? So to Sam's point, the idea of a specific tax incentive is a tiny piece of a multifaceted system. And some of it is culture, but I think that the economics of it go very deep, where you look at urban areas where there's lots of great jobs and young people want to live. Housing is very, very expensive and in short supply. And in the most prosperous places, it's in the shortest supply and extremely expensive, and we've made it very hard to build. And if you make housing cheaper, that's much more impactful than a child tax credit would be, right? Like, the cost of housing is a third of people's income. So 5%, 10% change in housing prices is much bigger than the value of a child tax credit. You look at things like the cost of childcare, and it's wonderful that there's like people who want to work and both parents want to work, but when you do that, it's very, very expensive to take care of the kid. And we have an education system that has historically started in kindergarten. And that's pretty late, like that's 5 years. And so things like universal pre-K or pre-K could make a big difference. And so structuring the entire economic system to create abundance and affordability and cost of living is going to be more powerful than any one specific incentive. But doing that is so very difficult because there's so many bottlenecks to those outcomes.
To Lyman's point, the next administration, Trump should promise to baptize every third child, right?
I mean, he does have his own Bible, so, I do want to mention the housing thing. This is really important. So people think of Americans as having big houses. It is true that square footage of house, like cross-nationally, is pretty strongly predictive of family size. But that actually started to decline. Like, the average size of new houses in the US hasn't risen in like 15 years. It's actually slightly down. And the interesting thing is, if you then ask, okay, how many bedrooms are in that square footage? Okay, the average square footage per bedroom is rising, which is to say a 1,500 square foot apartment maybe in the past was 2 bedrooms. Now it's like 1 in a little like remote work nook. So what's going on is, even when we have the square footage for a family, we build it for a childless person. And actually, at the Pronatalism Initiative, our first big project that we're working on is we just finished fielding a huge survey on this, where we basically gave people forced choices on types of houses and neighborhoods, and then various indicators of family and prices to see what trade-offs they're willing to make and what things they think would be supportive for family. And it shows up crystal clear. People want a lot of bedrooms. But that's just not how you build houses now. You build a giant open floor plan with no walls on it, which means no matter where you are, the baby can hear you. And my baby can hear me. So if you hear some squawking, 2 of us have babies in the room. So.
But the last thing is, 15 years ago, we had an enormous financial crisis. And that left both economic security shocks for people coming out of college then and changed lifetime earnings and career trajectories. And then simultaneously, we started underproducing housing at a rapid rate, right? Like in the response to the housing bubble. And so, the correlation is not causation, but you've seen a lot of these housing
in this case, it's causal.
There you go. So,
Derek, I'd like to ask you a little bit more about inclusive abundance and how we hear from some folks that people aren't having kids because they're worried about climate change. They're worried about the future. But I think we're a pretty positive crew here. We're thinking the future is going to be bright. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the cultural narrative question. And you've seen in many publications, the New Yorker, the New York Times have had articles about people being afraid to bring kids into the world because of climate change. And this trade-off between sustainability and prosperity is very much a scarcity mindset. And 30, 40 years ago, when you looked at the mix of energy generation, that was not necessarily false. But with wind and solar and nuclear and geothermal and battery storage, we have a technological mix of energy generation that's now available that can enable both people in the developing world to leave poverty and people in the developed world to expand in population. If you look at agricultural productivity, there's lots of amazing potential that technology has unlocked, but that technology has to be deployed at scale. And so some of the problem we have, just like with housing, where there's permitting issues and lots of veto choke points where some person with a hyper-local objection to a project can block the project, even though it would cause massive benefit for society. This exists also in transmission and siting of energy generation. And so in inclusive abundance, we're really interested in and excited about the prospect of finding coalitions of people who want to change these policies and streamline some of these regulations, not at the cost of damaging the environment, but actually for the benefit of protecting the environment through the deployment of these technologies in a way that also allows kids and families to come into the world and thrive and flourish without that being at the expense of carbon emissions.
Well, I'll just also add, this goes to the idea that human ingenuity is the ultimate resource, right? And that more people means more ideas, means more innovation, means more solutions to climate change and other issues. And even beyond sort of like innovation, like one of the main ways that declining population impacts economic growth is the fact that if you want to build a highway or any kind of major infrastructure or energy, you have to amortize that across decades. And if there's going to be fewer people on the road 50 years from now than there are today, then it's like you have a massive hurdle to that investment that you would now are not going to make. But if you know that the population is going to be bigger 50 years from now, you can do all kinds of crazy stuff. And it's not a coincidence that the U.S. built so much of its infrastructure during a period of rapid population growth. And I think this also ties in as well with the Israel example. I think it's not a mistake that they both have a very high fertility rate. They have lots of policies to support that, from IVF to they have this parenting hour policy where after you return from parental leave, you're still entitled to take an hour or two off from work to go breastfeed, to go run errands, to do things like that, sort of work-life balance. All that's true, but I think it's also connected to the fact that they have become a tech and exporting powerhouse, right? It's this deeper cultural sense of mission, and this is why babies are industrial policy in a few ways.
Well, that leads into my next question, which I'm going to give to you, Lyman. Why are we talking about this at a tech conference? I think it's a very pressing topic, but I'd like to hear kind of why you think this has to do with technology.
Yeah, I like the idea that babies are industrial policy, but it's organic manufacturing. So, I mean, on one level, I mean, human reproduction is kind of like the lowest tech thing you've got, right? I mean, it's still basically working with the same material that we've had for hundreds of thousands of years. And there's been actually, over the last 30,000 years, surprisingly little directional selection on anything related to reproduction. There's only one genetic loci that's been under active selection. But on the other hand, there is an interesting technology story here. And the one people think of is obviously like IVF or artificial wombs. I'm not going to dwell on that too much. What we're trying to do at the Pronatalism Initiative is basically call balls and strikes on which policies work, which ones don't. IVF subsidies have been researched for a very long time. We know a lot about them, and we know that they have no effect on fertility for a variety of reasons. However, there are policies that we know do, and there are innovations that we know can work. So IVF targets a very small segment of the population, but the single largest leverage point in the biological fertility process is not older people who can't conceive, it's miscarriage, right? The burden of miscarriage in human reproduction is about 15 to 20% of detected pregnancies. In scientifically surveyed populations, it's 30 to 50%, okay? There's a compassionate diagnosis that we give people when they experience miscarriage, which is that this child probably wasn't survivable, there's probably chromosomal abnormalities. But we know that this is usually not true. In cases of recurrent miscarriage, so people who experience lots of miscarriage, which is an extremely painful thing for people, aside from like pronatal benefits, I just want to note that like we're talking not just about making lives, preventing serious harm to people who are currently alive, if we can address this. For people with recurrent miscarriage, we know that half of those miscarriages are blood clotting issues that we can largely treat with current medication. Basically, pretty much all pregnant women in America now will be given baby aspirin. The reason why is because we know it reduces miscarriage a little bit, but we also know that small molecule heparins like enoxaparin, which sells under the brand name Lovenox, does even more for people with recurrent miscarriage. The problem is we don't start giving it to people until they've lost 3, 4, 5, 6 pregnancies, which is weird because we can genetically test for a lot of the conditions that cause it. So with better genetic screening for people, with wider acceptance of a drug that like didn't begin to enter the standard of care conversation until 2021, even though it's been commercially available since 1990. There's a lot of innovations that we can do that if we could take away 10% of miscarriages, first of all, we're taking away a lot of harm and suffering from people. Second of all, we're adding a lot of babies. There's other things. I mean, there's vaccines tested right now for cytomegalovirus. These are going to be the first vaccines aimed at pregnant women because cytomegalovirus is the leading cause of congenital blindness in children. We're on the edge of curing morning sickness. These are incredibly valuable innovations that radically alter the kinds of costs facing parents. Huge segments. I mean, morning sickness is like 70% of pregnancies. And that also dramatically improve the lives of people currently alive today on things we all agree are harms. In ways that finding a way to select a slightly better embryo is maybe less influential on the whole population.
Sam, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. You also told me to ask you about AI, so.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe we'll find
Is AGI a baby?
Yeah, GLP-1 agonists make you want to have babies. Yeah, one thing I think about just in the long term is will this trend continue, right? Because broadly speaking, the decline in fertility across really every developed country is a consequence of what is known as the demographic transition, right? As your country gets richer, you move from agriculture to manufacturing to services. You shift from having 10 kids so that 3 of them survive and care for the farm and care for you in old age, to having 1 or 2 kids that you invest a lot in and make sure they get into an Ivy League school and so forth. And that's really driven by the structure of opportunity costs, the nature of our economy, the rewards that go to human capital. And if, per my previous conversation with Jack Clark, if, we have whole cities of AIs arriving at our shore soon, does human capital, the premium invert? Does the opportunity cost associated with having kids massively shift, where it suddenly becomes a lot easier to have childcare because you can hire a robot to do it, or iPad kids become AI teddy bear kids, and it'd be wonderful if, like, I had a Furby growing up, if that Furby taught me Spanish and calculus and like ask
You had
any
an
question.
amazing Furby.
If it did, instead it just made weird noises and then when the battery was low. And so like, we don't actually know what's on the other side of this transition, and it could be a world that in some ways looks a little bit more Forager-esque, right? If we get into true post-scarcity. And the question is what we're going to do with all our time. Hopefully we're not just like wire-headed to a AI girlfriend, but like are actually using the technology to be more human. And so that's just a speculative question, because I think it's a huge wild card here that people haven't really quite studied closely.
I want to jump in just on robot nannies, because I think this is actually a great example of like different ways to think about fertility. So robot nannies would dramatically reduce the cost of having kids. Like, I think that's very clear. If you had like an efficient, like very affordable AI humanoid robot that can like change diapers and stuff like that. Okay, so is that going to boost fertility? And okay, maybe. And there's some research that like more low-skilled immigration can sometimes boost the fertility of high-skilled people, though it reduces the fertility of the low-skilled people. But the interesting thing is to think about the benefit side. So what's the benefit of having a child to the parent? There's a lot of benefits. Maybe you just think it's fulfilling an ethical imperative. Maybe you just value continuing the species. Maybe you just really like your own genes and you like to see them replicated. But what a lot of people like is being with their kid. Like, that's actually the cool part of having kids, is like being with them and holding them. And actually some of the best parts of parenting are, this can sound weird, but like changing diapers, like doing the things that are the work of parenting. Actually playing with your kids is really exhausting. But like teaching them things and like instructing them things and showing them how to do things, that's actually really rewarding. And my worry is that we're actually outsourcing a lot of the benefits of parenting. And so like daycare work, no matter how you like try to increase the wages of daycare work, you just can't push wages up. Why? Because there's so many people who want to do it, right? There's a reserve pool of labor of people who do this for free. Moms and stay-at-home dads, but disproportionately moms. And so every time we try to do things to like boost wages in the childcare sector, they just immediately fall back to like whatever the legal minimum in the area is, because there's so many people who love to do this, because it's enormously rewarding. And we know this from tons of different studies. So my concern is we might do things that are aimed at the cost side without thinking about what we're doing to the benefit side of having kids. And so what we really want to do is we want to make the benefit side as big as possible, right? We want to find ways to give parents maximally pleasant experiences with their kids. And I think there's an open question on how to do that. I don't have an answer for that. But so that's kind of reflecting there on just the question of managing cost versus benefit.
And Derek, talking more about the benefits for parents. I mean, besides giving people $2,000, what other novel ideas should we be thinking about here?
It was $3,000.
$3,000. I'm so sorry.
$3,600 for kids. Having three guys up here on stage talking about this, I think, is something that we should be
Guys,
thoughtful.
I'm here. It's fine.
No, I know you're This is a tech conference, and there were technical answers. It's an exceptionally personal issue. And choices people make, the freedom that we've achieved with women working and having meaningful careers, and the challenges of both parents or a single parent trying to figure out how to balance all of these competing objectives. Like, this is all really hard stuff and really emotional stuff. And fundamentally, how we can tinker with the machinery of our society to allow people to benefit from these profoundly emotional decisions and relationships that they can have. Yes, there's a return on having kids, and yes, like, there were great farmhands and things like that back in different countries and different places in time. I think the population demographic questions of this are a piece of a broader puzzle of how we have a great society, how we have a society that functions with human flourishing. And I want to just make sure that when we're having these discussions, we frame them both with the appropriate emotional sensitivity, but then also with like really smart, tightly crafted policy that creates outcomes that we want.
And I think this may be one of the few panels where we haven't talked about China yet. I know that we did talk a little bit about other countries where things are going there, but broader geopolitical competition. I mean, this is kind of for Lyman, kind of for Sam, whoever wants to take it. Do you think that we're going to innovate our way or be more abundant just because we're going to have more people here in the future?
I've talked too much, so if somebody else wants to have the first crack, I'll see them.
I think China's demographic headwinds are a bit overrated. Having a billion plus people is a huge advantage in the first place, right? So they have a very high level, secondarily from the rate of growth. So I'm fully on board for the Matt Iglesias 1 billion Americans policy. We should, that is a national imperative that we have a bigger population in this country. The other thing with China is the fact that, yes, well, they did have the one-child policy and their birth rate is cratered. The education pyramid as a function of age is such that they're still adding millions of college-educated human capital to their economy every year, and they will for the next 20 years or so. So even if as their population peaks and begins to decline, they will still be adding human capital. And for most of the geopolitical questions we're concerned about, it is more in that 20-year horizon than in the 100-year horizon where these things really start to bind. But I would love to hear Lyman talk a little bit on the broader developing world question, because a lot of this has been centered around declining fertility in rich first world countries, but we've seen collapsing fertility in across the board. India is now well below replacement. So I don't know if you can speak to that. You had a great post about there not being too many Africans, as some people used to think.
Yeah. I actually broadly agree with what you're saying about China as well. I'll say, China's already bearing a lot of the difficulty of an adverse demographic situation, and it is already holding them back in certain ways, but not like apocalyptically. So not in a way that just like gives the U.S. like a free get out of great power competition free card. So the 421 problem in China, that's 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 grandchild, means that a lot of Chinese people, a lot of those grandkids are caring for just an enormous number of old people in their personal lives, let alone through like social transfers. And that's already holding back their career development and stuff. And we already see that. And it's going to get worse, but there's no point that we're going to be like, oh, this is the day where China really had demographic challenges. Like, they're already here. In the wider developing world, I think this is really fascinating. So with limited time, I can't get into this too much, but it turns out declining fertility is mostly not predicted by rising income. So like India is below replacement rate fertility, even though their incomes are still really low. And also it's not like women's labor force participation is really high in India. It's quite low. The best predictor of falling fertility is basically just how much of your media content is in English language broadcasts from the West. Like the more of your media you're getting from the West, the lower your fertility is. We have great studies of this where like during the Cold War, we can see like topography influences radio broadcasts. So we can see like villages and towns near the border of like East and West Germany that like got more Western broadcasts and they have fewer kids. And we can see this all over the world, that basically this is a cultural thing where first we colonize countries and then we colonize their brains. And we convince them to not have kids. Africa is a great example of this. People think of African fertility as high. African fertility is rock bottom low compared to their incomes. When Western Europe had incomes at African levels, they were cranking out 6, 7 kids each on average. In Africa, it's 4. Fertility is falling in Africa faster compared to income than anywhere else we've seen other than South Asia and some parts of East Asia. So I think Africa's going to have low fertility pretty soon. And yet they'll still be poor. So they'll be caring for old people when they do not have any resources to do so. And after all of their talented young people have moved to America to help us solve our problems, which my view is that'll be a humanitarian disaster for poor countries.
Well, we are just about finished. So, Derek, I'm going to let you take the final word, and I'm asking for more positivity so that we can leave this on.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for such a great panel and for such a great conference. The thing I'm most optimistic about is that there is a lot of cross-partisan or nonpartisan framing of many of these issues where I think in a world with a lot of polarization and a lot of unsolvable problems, some of these abundance policies that can help bring down cost of living, I think there's really interesting coalitions that are emerging. And so I'm excited to participate in rooms like this where we can try to find ways to work together.
Wonderful. Thank you, gentlemen. And our final panel for the evening is Preparing for Multipolarity, featuring Josh Simon, Meg Reese, Jamal Jaffer, and Marshall Kozloff.